I'm going to generalize a little bit here, but in Japan, Japan is relatively known for being a little bit more indirect in terms of communication, in terms of feedback. Folks in Japan who, dealing with these kinds of issues, how would you kind of coach them through kind of figuring out how to be more direct? Maybe they know it a little bit inside, but they haven't been able to kind of fix it.
So now you have me giving you this advice, let's be direct. And you're saying, well, it's not really culturally as accepted. And so let me offer this. Here's a set of ideas, which I think actually applies no matter where you are, which is a lot of giving good feedback is making sure you've created the conditions. I think of it as that you have permission. I would just invite you to say, think of it more that we're sitting next to each other and we're looking at some work. We're not actually talking about me, am I a good person? No, we're talking about I just did some work product. Maybe I built a model, an analytical tool. Maybe it's a presentation that we're gonna make to a client, And what you and I are gonna do is sit next to each other and we're gonna talk about that work.
Hi everyone, I'm here today at Stripe Sessions for the second time. I was here last year and we got to interview a few folks, but this year we're interviewing Claire Hughes Johnson, the author of Scaling People. Claire, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and returning to Sessions.
Yeah. Can you give a quick intro about yourself and kind of your background, because I think it's very unique.
Oh, wow. I feel very fortunate. I had a sort of varied early career, but I moved out to California and ended up working at Google. So I was at Google from before the IPO, in 2004 to 2014, so almost 11 years, in various roles at Google, in sort of operations, sales, more of a GM and product role, and then became the COO of Stripe. And I was the COO for almost 6.5 years. And so I now am a corporate advisor to the company. I still work for Stripe, do some work every week, including this week. But now I serve on boards, I do some investing, and I did have the fortune I did write a book as toward the end of my time as the COO that came out in 2023. And then recently
in Japan.
In Japan, yes.
We were very fortunate. We got contacted by one of the publisher asked to write a book review, and so we wrote a book review. But I read it in English first because I prefer reading in English. But it was incredible. I think what I do want to ask. You mentioned, I think, on the Tim Ferriss podcast that you tend not to finish a lot of business books. Can you talk about why that is, but then why write one?
Yeah, that's an excellent way of phrasing that question. So I pick up business books, and I find most of them make their main argument, which are valuable, but in sort of the introduction of the first few chapters, like you sort of get the gist. Like they have a framework, and they want you to understand the framework. You understand it, and then a lot of the book maybe are examples of that, but it doesn't sort of keep me engaged. I tend to read more fiction, as I said to Tim, and sort of study the human experience more than study business frameworks. And so, no, I wasn't actually setting out to write a business book. That was not one of my life goals. But in the course of building Stripe, John and Patrick and I all had the observation, Stripe is so fortunate because they're really a platform and an infrastructure for a lot of companies. So we meet founders of interesting companies, leaders, CEOs of interesting companies, globally, all around the world, and at various different stages. But a lot of the conversation, when you get together with folks like that, is about organizational topics, scaling topics, leadership topics. How do you do this thing? How do you do company planning? How do you handle leadership hiring? And John and Patrick started to encourage me to write down because they felt like my advice, I guess, to them was valuable, but I really do enjoy these interactions with companies of all shapes and sizes. I did agree with them that there wasn't a business book that was as tactical as the one they were envisioning. So a lot of the business books you and I were just talking about have sort of a general subject, a general framework, but then how do you apply it, right, becomes the question you get. And so John and Patrick felt, and they're both, very self-taught, and they have read, I think, a lot of management and business books themselves, and they felt like there wasn't one that got into the details. How do you do the thing? Show me an example of this thing you're describing, a hiring rubric, for example. Like, what does that look like?
Right.
And so what does a QBR document look like? And that is something that founders particularly enjoy. They want to just see exactly what does that thing that you're describing look like in detail. And so I'm not sure that, so I agreed with them that this thing did not exist, this tactical guide. I didn't know if I agreed that I should be the one to write it, but they're very persuasive, the Stripe founders. I think that is an ingredient to founder success. So we agreed to try. And so that started me on a journey of working on the book.
I think to your point, though, the practicalness of the book, specifically writing, it's not just like a guideline, right? It's specifically like, what did you actually use?
Yes.
I think
Very
it's often missing, and like maybe you find it on like blogs and different places, but you don't find it on books. So I think like
yeah.
I
actually do think of the book sometimes I describe to be, because it's more of a reference manual, but it's like a collection of blog posts, right? I'd like to think a little more polished and edited, but yeah, all the exercises, the templates, the examples, and that's why we have the QR codes in the book so that you can link out and see the online versions.
So I'm assuming, when you first joined Stripe, while there's probably some sort of organizational structure, I think you brought a lot of, of new kind of guidelines, frameworks to it. Did it require a lot of convincing with Patrick and John to kind of implement all these things? Oftentimes, founders and entrepreneurs feel limited by kind of if they're given specific types of frameworks, and often they're not. They're types to kind of go beyond that.
Yeah. Again, a very carefully worded question. Thank you. So I think that what a lot of founders resist, and I resist it, is someone who comes in and says, this is how you do this thing, right? This is the playbook. Or don't you know everyone does X? And these are unique companies, and they have unique missions and products, and they're not going to take something off the shelf that some other company did and like just say, okay, this is going to apply to me. No.
Right.
And so I think that how I introduce some of the things that I brought, and by the way, some of the things I brought into the company were not particularly novel. It was just the right time to start, thinking about goals and thinking about planning and how we organize certain teams. But there were already employees who were bringing ideas forward. I wasn't, I think, particularly unique. But I think what worked the best, and what works the best, frankly, as advice to anyone joining any new organization, is listen. Listen, ask questions, try to understand why they do the things they do, then understand the business and sort of say, well, knowing where we are, what our objectives are, let's talk through some ideas. And there was one distinct conversation I remember we used to take these offsite days where we'd go and have these deeper conversations. We were talking about performance management. And I said, we could spend a lot of hours designing and building and buying a tool or building a tool to do this. And we don't have that time. I said, I don't think we're going to build the best version. But in this case, I think don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's more important that we have a performance management process at this stage of company where people are getting feedback.
Right.
And if you'll kind of trust me, I'm going to build a kind of vanilla, simple, easy to roll out version so that we have it.
Right.
And I think for them, that was a leap of faith. It's hard as a founder to say, okay, we're not going to design the most perfect thing, like the way we do our product, but we're going to accept that having something is better than nothing.
Right.
And I think that was on their part trust. I had built up some credibility, and that I wasn't going to sort of take us in a bad direction, but it was just going to be maybe more basic.
And was the point of that to kind of implement it first and then to iterate and kind of customize it as the company grows?
Yeah, learn from it. I mean, I will say I was surprised how long the thing that I implemented actually stuck around, but it was actually quite simple, and simple is sometimes the right answer. I think these processes can get overbuilt.
Right.
But yes, the idea was to learn, get some data, get some feedback, as we do from our users, and understand what's working, what's not working.
So I want to shift a little bit. You talked in your book about something called Stripe Home, which evolved from Stripe People.
Yes.
Can you, and first of all, I think the name Home was I don't know how intentional that was, because I think in one of your in your books you talk, one of the 4 principles is coming back to your operating system, and home seems like the perfect kind of segue to that. Was it intentional? And then can you talk a little about what Stripe Home is?
So Stripe Home is really, a name that we gave for the intranet, meaning the home page for any employee of Stripe to go to if they were looking for information, whether that was about, who's on this team, or what are the goals of that team, or you can find company goals, documents, and I think the home concept, actually, come back to the operating system. I love that connection you're making. It didn't come from that as much as it came from the idea of, if you think about someone starting their day, like, you start at home, and what's our start point? And how do we get information organized in a way that's helpful to folks internally? Because Stripe is complicated.
Right.
It's a complicated industry that we're in. We have a very, our job as Stripe is to simplify that complexity for our user. But internally, we're grappling with a lot as a member of the financial ecosystem, as well as products that are actually fairly intricate. And so understanding how what product is, what each team is working on, what their objectives are, who's on it, who do you go to for decisions, like that stuff becomes very important if you want to move with speed as you start to scale. So really, home was also a way to acknowledge, hey, we're getting bigger as a company, and we want to help organize information so people don't have sort of cognitive overload.
Right, to create common kind of interfaces, and to make it kind of known what Stripe is as well, right, and just internally.
Yes, internally.
That makes sense.
What are people working on? How do I connect to them? We all want to know those things.
And then I think, but there's always a pushback here, right? I think especially with innovative companies, creating kind of a standardization of things.
Yes.
Oftentimes, there's always outlier cases, and there's always outlier people, and often founders and people who work at startups are outlier folks. How do you kind of balance the two, kind of standardization and kind of outlier talent?
Yeah. So I think it kind of goes back to the answer I gave, which is, are we going to take hours and hours to design every single thing we do as a company? No, because we have priorities. We have a reason we exist. We have our mission. We have our users. We have our product. And so you have to, I think, make decisions about what is okay to be fairly standard and exist, and then where do we want to be an outlier?
Right.
Where do we want to be unique and celebrate? I interviewed Kari Saarinen, who's the founder of Linear, on stage here at Sessions on a side stage a couple days ago. And he did a beautiful job of explaining, like, the stuff that he really wanted to be intentional about in how he built the company has become a little bit what the company's about.
Right.
Very well designed, high quality, thoughtful product. That's what they hire for. That's what their product is meant to represent. That's how they operate the company. He's like, that thing that was sort of quirky and unique that I decided to focus on, meaning he would make choices. I'm not going to grow this team until I think we have the quality, becomes their defining element. And that's your outlier. That's your, why are you unique? You don't want to look like every other company. And so you definitely want to identify those things, celebrate them, pursue them. But what you don't want to do is try to do that for everything.
Right.
Because you'll just never get off. You'll never get off home.
Yeah.
You'll never get off first base. So I think with talent, you are describing a phenomenon then that does happen where really talented people, and particularly creative people, particularly innovative. Stripe employs quite a few former founders, for example.
Right.
They don't have as high a tolerance for sort of standard operating procedure stuff, right? And that's just, we're generalizing, but that's okay. I think that's a fair generalization. And so how do you make sure whatever your standard stuff is not too high friction, is explained. This is why we do this thing. I know you don't love it, and it's maybe not the most unique thing we do, but we're going to accept that. We're going to commit, and then we're going to let you really focus on the stuff that is the highest impact for our mission that you do. And people appreciate being honest about that, inviting them in, and then telling them we recognize you have other things to do with your time.
That makes sense. And I think, to your point about kind of the intentionality, I think that's often what separates companies too, right? Because oftentimes, like, if you look at it, the core product is not so dissimilar, or like the people aren't so dissimilar sometimes. But where you choose to be intentional is the hardest part.
Where you choose to be excellent, where you choose to be an outlier.
Right. But then I guess beyond that, like, you can't just be intentional with everything. And so you need kind of these processes and different kind of, what it is, you can call it standards, you can call it something else, and infrastructure to essentially enable people to focus on what they want to be intentional about.
Yes. Yeah, again, a tricky thing, because you're sort of taking this alchemy, which is like, what are the things that are our core that we want to be intentional about, and be able to notice them, identify them, talk about them, document it, but not kill it, right? By not making it too corporate. And you also want to help people have space to explore those things. And, but I do think that is, but you can't, if you don't standardize some elements of it, then it's just chaotic.
Definitely.
Right?
Definitely.
It is the trick. It is the trick that, this is why I like company building, because there's sort of these basic building blocks, but then it's how do you celebrate what uniquely occurs as, what I think ends up building enduring businesses.
So in your book, you talked a little bit about kind of feedback communication and the importance of giving direct feedback. But I think your view has kind of changed and shifted over time. Can you talk a little about kind of the evolution that you've had with this?
Yeah, I mean, my personal evolution, which is I think what you're referring to, is that when I was a newer manager, I think I was putting too much of a premium on being liked. And also support. Like you want to support your team. You want them to know you have their back. You're in their corner. You're there to coach them. You're there to help them succeed. Those are all true, by the way. But I think I was shying away from giving more direct, hard feedback. And frankly, even not just at the individual level, even just setting the bar. This is something founders do very well, which is they set sometimes what feels like an unreasonable standard of excellence. And we should be able to ship that thing next week. And it should be ready to go. You're like, whoa.
I think you hear this very often with Stripe.
You do. We have a very high expectation for quality, for craft, for excellence. And I think I wasn't holding my team in that way. I was almost too empathetic. So the journey I had to go on was really, well, first to look myself in the eye and say, am I doing this team any favors by being overly, indirect and frankly overly nice when the work wasn't at the right quality, whether that's with the individual or the team. And I had to give up. Ironically, I felt like I was giving up being liked. And in fact, if you look at various survey scores I've had as upward feedback, people celebrated me more as a manager and leader the sort of tougher I got. So I had the wrong intuition about what they wanted. There's a framework that I really enjoy that Frances Fry has in, I think, at least one of her books, which is Move Fast and Fix Things. This came out fairly recently. But it's this concept of you sort of want to have very high standards and very high care. Right? That combination, and she calls that justice. People want justice. You care about me and my success, but you're holding me to a very high standard. And if you don't do either of those things, that's called neglect. Right? But what do you do when you really care about someone but you don't hold them to a high standard? They don't really think you care about them unless they're maybe your grandma. That's anyway. So I really think that has borne out for me as I look at, especially with top talent, they want to get better. And if you're not sort of very clear with them about here's the gap I see, here's what it's going to take to get better, they're going to stop being motivated to do the work either with you or the work overall. So
I think I'm going to generalize a little bit here, but in Japan, Japan is relatively known for being a little bit more indirect in terms of communication, in terms of feedback. To folks in Japan who are dealing with these kinds of issues, how would you kind of coach them through kind of figuring out how to be more direct? Maybe they know it a little bit inside, but they haven't been able to kind of fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I've done work. I love Japan, first of all. It's one of my favorite places to visit in the world, and I've been 4 or 5 times, mostly for business, so for Google and then for Stripe. And I've worked, in the business context in Japan, and I recognize the generalization you're sharing, and I think that's true in a few cultures, and that can even also be true in certain company cultures. And so now you have me giving you this advice, let's be direct, and you're saying, well, it's not really culturally as accepted. And so let me offer this. Here's a set of ideas, which I think actually applies no matter where you are, which is a lot of giving good feedback is making sure you've created the conditions. I think of it as that you have permission. And I think this is more comfortable. And so how do you do, and the analogy I often use is, too often we think of a feedback situation where I'm the boss person and you're the employee, and it almost feels oppositional.
Right.
I'm going to tell you about yourself.
Yep.
Right? And I would just invite you to say, think of it more that we're sitting next to each other and we're looking at some work. We're not actually talking about me, am I a good person? No. We're talking about, I just did some work product. Maybe I built a model, an analytical tool. Maybe it's a presentation that we're going to make to a client, you know. And what you and I are going to do is sit next to each other, and we're going to talk about that work because we want it to be better.
Right.
And you're going to learn from it, and hopefully I'm going to learn from it as the boss, right? So I first get your framework around, no, it's just you sitting with someone, looking at something and saying, let's talk about what's working and what's not working. And the way I ask permission is I say, first of all, let's say it's a presentation. How did you think, that presentation went? I want to get your opinion.
Right.
And I know this is not as common maybe in some more hierarchical companies, but you want to invite the person in. How did you think it went? And they'll maybe offer a few thoughts. And then you want to say, well, would you be interested in some, you're asking, like, I have some ideas. By the way, I'm not telling you it was bad.
Right.
I have some ideas. And I noticed this thing. And I wonder if you could try this. Like, but that is sort of direct, saying, like, you seemed nervous.
Right.
Maybe next time we practice together.
Right.
Like, or there were a lot of words on that particular slide.
Right.
I had found it hard to follow. Maybe, I'm offering you ideas. You've said, yes, I'd like to hear them. And I think you could have a very polite version of a conversation about work.
Right.
And how to make the work better. And people really do want that.
Yeah.
Most people.
No, I love how you framed it in terms of, like, even what you said. It's so important, right? Because you feel the dynamics shift. Even if based on positioning of where you sit. It's incredible.
And that you're talking about work, not the person. Like, I'm not saying to you, I think you're a bad presenter.
Right.
No one wants that feedback, and that's not true. There's a moment you had in that one presentation where you could have been better.
Right.
I'm sure that happened to be today. and someone feels like you're their ally.
Makes sense. So you mentioned as a leader, what you're really trying to do is convey and receive meaning. And I think this is really, really difficult sometimes because it's hard to tell how much you've actually been able to convey your meaning, how much they've been able to receive it, how much you are receiving out of the meeting. And so what are some kind of concrete ways for folks to kind of be able to tell whether they've actually been able to convey and receive?
So this is another, I think, way that you can engage with more questions, right? Or summarizing. Meaning, I say often when I'm coaching leaders about they're in an all-hands meeting or a situation where they're asking questions from the team or even from customers or investors, and often the question you get is not the actual question, right? And especially in an indirect environment.
Yes.
They're asking something and you're like, and you want to pause for a moment and you want to think, is that the real question, or should I try to answer what I think it is?
Right.
And so you sort of restate it. Says it sounds like you're trying to understand the strategic announcement we made. Let me check with you.
Right.
And the person's nodding. You're like, okay, I'm going to try to answer the real question.
Right.
But I checked to make sure I got your meaning. And I think this is really true when you give feedback to someone or an assignment.
Right.
And you can either ask them, why don't you repeat back to me what you think is critical here? Like, have them give themselves the assignment in front of you almost, so that you can say, yes, we are on the same page. Or if someone comes to me and says, I have all these things going on, I can't prioritize that, and I say, let me summarize. Here's what I heard you say. You have these 5 things, and you want my input on what the priority is.
Right.
I'm checking the meaning.
Right.
And I think there's not enough playing back. Really, this is just active listening.
Right.
Playing back, summarizing, checking. Are we on the same page? Because, by the way, that's so low cost to just do 5 minutes of check.
Yes.
That's the assignment. That's the priority. Because 1 week later,
the cost is so big.
The cost is so high. They've gone and done all this work, and you're like, oh, that was not the plan. Or someone asks a question and then they're frustrated because you didn't really answer the question, and they think you're inauthentic, right? So I think that checking, summarizing, clarifying is so powerful. And again, it's not being overly direct. It's just being more active participant.
Got it. I know we're running out of time. I think we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. I want to ask kind of 2 questions. We might end up only doing on one, but one is about kind of AI. I think we kind of have to talk about AI, but I want to talk specifically about how it affects organizations.
Sure.
So imagine a world where we do have these, digital labor, AI agents within our companies as employees, as colleagues.
Yes.
Does the entire kind of model of how we build and kind of how we organize companies break? Does it, how do we need to rethink this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think about this a lot, and I do think people ask me if I'm going to write another book, and I think I may have to rewrite my book for the age of AI, but it's going to take a few years to figure out. I'm going to make an assumption in answering this that there is not AI has taken over, but in fact it is a partnership, but there is some human alignment and control, right? So let's assume we've achieved that. And I think the answer is, it is going to feel very different, but it is not actually fundamentally different, which is for centuries, humans have been organizing.
Right.
Like the concept of management structures is not new, right? I mean, it is a way that we organize. But what's going to happen is, conceivably, you have fewer human employees than you might have had, depending on the size of your enterprise. You're still going to have them.
Right.
You just might have fewer. You might have, as you said, AI, either employees or really humans that do the work of 3 or 4 humans because they have assistants. They're amplified. And so that actually puts even more of a premium on your talent and how you organize them and how you make it clear, like, what work are we trying to achieve? Because you're betting on this select few humans with the AI superpowers to achieve those goals. And so I think the book is, frankly, like as important or more important. However, some of the scaling structures maybe, I hope, can be more efficient, can feel better in a way. You can maybe customize some things more because you're not just handling as much human volume, if you will. And as we had Mark Zuckerberg on the stage here at Sessions the other day, I mean, he has a conception of there's some tasks that we wish we had more humans to do and we could do better if we did. We actually might be more excellent. We might have operational work we're doing with the AI agents that is a whole new area of our business that we need to manage. And then humans will need to help make sure that that's going well. But I don't think that fundamentally humans collectively gathering, organizing themselves towards a common goal is going to change. I just think there may be fewer of them, and there may be a way we work, how we accomplish tasks that's quite different. And what you're going to increasingly need, this has always been true, but really highly adaptable human beings in your organization who can really operate at multiple levels, so sort of the task work process quality level, but up to strategically, are we, how we're doing this work in this new way, is it achieving the longer term objectives? They have to be very strategic and adaptable.
Makes sense. So last question, and you could take this in a good way or a bad way. What keeps you up at night?
I think a lot of the role of leaders is to provide perspective and to frame things in a way that helps folks understand, okay, what moment are we in? I want to almost provide a substrate of stability and consistency. And we are in a really, I mean, in my lifetime, more anxious and disrupted feeling time, and I'm talking about a lot of elements of the macro environment. I'm sure you're nodding. I think you understand that. I mean, I don't care where you're sitting in the world. Everyone is experiencing a combination of technical change and disruption, geopolitical change and disruption,
social and cultural
impacts of those things happening more rapidly, frankly, and that makes sense. The technical cycles, there's a really excellent book called Generations that really makes, by Jean Twenge, that argues like what defines the generations we like to name is actually the technology of that generation, and what's happening is it's just happening more rapidly. So we're also getting these sub-generation moments, like the kids who were born when this tool, when TikTok was out and not, and I see it in my own children. And so I think what keeps me up at night is, how do we lead? How do we lead in an age of anxiety and uncertainty? And And we have to lead. In fact, it's more important than ever. But I need to constantly reset my own framework, my own perspective. How do I explain this to myself? And how do I think about a positive path forward given what I don't know? And there's a lot more that I feel like I can't predict or I don't know. And I guess I would say to anyone listening, thinking of your role as a person who can synthesize and give folks a path where we can take positive action no matter the level of uncertainty, and that it will matter. And that, how to do that well keeps me up at night.
Amazing. Well, Claire, I know you have to run. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting me on Off Topic.
Thank you.